Hi everyone, welcome to my talk on mobile Vue.js. First of all, I would like to gauge do a little statistics in the room, like how many of you are developers? Okay, most of them. Good. And how many of you have used Vue.js? Ah, perfect. So that's good because I initially wanted to do more of an overview talk, but in the end I ended up including quite a few snippets and more or less no memes. So yeah, let's go. My name is Martin Sotirov. I'm a web developer, a freelance consultant based in Heidelberg. I have a small consultancy, and on the side I also do like seminars, workshops, that sort of thing in my Heidelberg office and also on premises at companies. And the topics are not just front-end, I also do PHP for some reason, Node.js, many different things. Right, so today we're gonna talk about cross-platform mobile apps. First, I want to go a little bit over the history and why we even want that. And then we'll go over the three main ways to do cross-platform mobile apps, especially with Vue currently. So I titled the first section, The Dream of Cross-Platform Mobile Apps. So this dream is actually nothing new. It's existed in some form or another since the 70s. Became really popular with Java in the 90s. And recently, since this guy came on stage, it's been really popular on mobile. So it's not a very well-known fact, but actually Steve Jobs, in a way, or Apple, invented progressive web apps, because Steve Jobs had this habit of always saying, there's one more thing. And during the 2007 keynote, the one more thing was actually web apps. So Steve Jobs personally was very opposed to the idea of third-party native apps. So his plan was to basically have PWAs, or how they called them back then, Web 2.0 apps. There was supposed to be no app store, no SDK that you would download, and most importantly, Apple wouldn't be responsible for all the fart apps that would get on the iPhone. So obviously some very smart people at Apple convinced him that this is not the best idea for the success of the iPhone. So right next year, Apple Store arrives. Coincidentally also Android. And almost from the start we have the first solutions to do cross-platform. Some of those quite old actually. Qt, for some of you who are familiar with the history of Nokia or Linux, is around since the 90s. PhoneGap was famously the first one that did actually web apps as, or one of the first ones to do web apps as installable mobile apps. The Titanium SDK from Accelerator was one of the first to do actually native widgets with the business logic in JavaScript, and soon quite a few started popping up. Some of those have fared better than others, some of those are actually extinct, and some of them are just showing up. So all of these actually could be grouped in one of three categories based on their approaches. The first one actually bundles all the web app assets in the actual app and displays it in a web view. Examples, Cordvan PhoneGap. We have the second approach, which tries to render native components on each respective platform and uses some common language for all the business logic, like, I don't know, C# or JavaScript. And the third approach, which is not that popular, but is also quite interesting, is to actually also do custom rendering, like Qt and Flutter does. So with Vue.js, we can leverage the first two categories. We could obviously package the Vue.js app in some kind of wrapper that we install on the device, or we could even render native components via something like NativeScript. Obviously, we have PWA, which is nowadays basically built into Vue. So today we're going to look at these three approaches to use Vue on mobile. The first one, progressive web apps. So the term itself was introduced by Google 2015, not to be confused with progressive enhancement, as in graceful degradation and so on. Although progressive enhancement is or should be a part of progressive apps, they should be progressively enhanced to have more features on more capable devices. Very important point is that PWA is not some kind of framework or tool, it's just a set of best practices that you should follow. Twitter is a really good example. Like if you open mobile Twitter on your device, and for example on iOS you click the share button, there's this, it looks a bit weird because it's the new iOS, but you click at the home screen and then you should get an app. So here I haven't labeled them, but I have the native app and the mobile app. Can someone tell me which one is native?
Middle one.
Yeah, middle one. You guessed it by the position of the title of the navigation bar, because it's more iOS, I guess. Yeah, that's the only way I can guess them apart too, also by the alignment of the title. Otherwise, if you use them on the device, it's virtually indistinguishable. Like for example, on the PWA, if you switch off the internet, open it back up, you have all the stuff that you already viewed. Now, if you try searching for something new, of course, it would say you're offline or something like that. So, what makes Twitter a good PWA? There's some things that every progressive web app should try to do, and most of these are actually common sense things that we're doing anyway. And of course, because it's in a way Google's baby, they have some specific things that they would want you to do in order to be installable. They actually have a checklist that you can see. It includes quite a lot of things, but the list can be boiled down to those 4 things. If you have a web manifest, a service worker, and you're served over HTTPS, that should be enough. You can include a custom icon, but even that's not required, because usually you have some kind of fav icon. So what's a web manifest? It's basically just a file that has some information about your app. You can configure things like custom icons for different sizes. You can maybe configure a splash screen if the device supports that at all. Covers and stuff like that. Now the really tricky part of those 4 conditions is actually the service worker. And not because it's very complicated, but more or less because there's a lot of mystery around it. There's a lot of confusion about what it is. What is this mysterious service worker? Well, it's just a JavaScript file that runs in the background. A good metaphor for it is sort of a proxy or gateway that sits between your app and the internet, because, for example, it can intercept all the requests that are incoming. It can cache the data for offline use later. It can handle push notifications if there's support for that. Thanks. Like for example, this is a really simple service worker. It basically does offline caching if we are requesting something that's from our website. It's not important how it does this, because it's also not the best idea to try to write one from the start. First of all, because there are really good tools to help you to do that. Second of all, because you can also use some kind of recipe that can be specifically tailored for specific use cases. I'll show a link later where you can find the recipes. But in the Vue.js world, where all of this stuff is almost automatically handled for us. Like I've gone to consult customers who actually have a PWA and they don't even know they have one. But because they created their app via the Vue CLI, it does almost all the work for them. Most importantly, many of you have probably seen this option in the Vue CLI. If you click it or use the Vue CLI to add PWA support later, the most obvious thing that happens is you have this new file register service worker. What it does is basically it provides a cleaner interface for your app to hook itself into different lifecycle events of the app, like going offline, going online, getting installed for the first time, things like that, and you can use those hooks to your advantage. This is not the service worker itself. This is just a way to hook yourself into it. Now, you can configure the way Vue.js actually creates the service worker and the web manifest for you using a Vue config file. You don't have one by default, you can create one. And then in the PWA block, you can specify some things. Most importantly, you can configure the Workbox plugin that actually does all the service worker things for you. This is a plugin by Google. The default mode is just fully automatic, you don't do anything. If you want to have your own service worker and still get some of the automatic Vue CLI magic, you can switch the mode to inject manifest, and then you give it the path where your actual service worker sits, and then Vue CLI manages to inject all the, for example, all the paths of your assets that need to be cached the first time where you install the app, like your JavaScript files, your images, your fonts, and so on. You can test how all this works with the Lighthouse test, which is built in DevTools. Or in the application tab, you can also inspect the actual individual things like the service worker itself, if it's running, what kind of stuff the manifest contains, all the cached files, and so on. Like here, for example, we are running the Lighthouse test on Twitter. We see it gets full points, except for this little thing, which is actually relates to the fact that this is a desktop browser and not an actual mobile device. Otherwise, full points. And like I said, in the application tab, we can see the service worker is registered and active. We can see all the cached assets and so on. Now, how's the browser support? It's nowadays actually quite good, except for the inventor of PWAs, which seems to hate them nowadays. Now, iOS 13, which just came out, did fix some really big problems that PWAs had on iOS. Like, I don't know, all PWAs were completely white in the app switcher. iOS wouldn't make a screenshot of it, little stuff like this. But glaringly, there's quite a few APIs still missing. And that's to some extent intentional. Apple doesn't want you, first of all, Apple doesn't want PWAs in the App Store. This statement is from earlier this month. It's basically a warning to all apps packaged as real apps who download any kind of assets from the internet. Basically, what it comes down to is Apple doesn't want you self-updating without the App Store. They also don't like the term PWA. They call them HTML5 apps. So, yeah. There's not really much more to say about PWAs on Vue because with the Vue CLI, it's mostly done for you. We can see some pointers to when to use it. Like I said, when you have Vue, you almost automatically have a PWA, so use it. You should use it as a sole means of distribution only in some specific cases. Like, for example, really good use case if you're doing some kind of internal company tool and you can afford to educate your users, or you're even pre-installing the app on devices for them. This is a really good use case. Obviously, don't use it if you want to get coverage in the app stores, if performance is critical, if you want to look native. Right, and we have some useful links. PWA Rocks is a good collection of well-done PWAs. We have, like the second link is, if you have to remember one link today, it's the second link. It's a website by Mozilla, which is a collection of recipes for different use cases. I find it's one of the best ways to learn how PWA service workers actually work, because they can get quite complicated. PWA stats, important if you want to convince someone, like some kind of manager or customer. The app manifest is a little tool that helps you write it generates a customized manifest for you. And the last one is just the checklist that Google wants you to follow. That's pretty much it. So the next kind of more...
One question, you said on Apple, there are limitations on iOS? Or
yes.
to find out about those limitations?
Well, first of all, can I use .com, I guess. Although the problem is that, for example, CanIUse would report that mobile Safari does have service worker support. They do have this and that. But for example, you can't use these things in a web view on iOS. So for example, there's no service worker support if you want to package your app as a Cordova app or as an Ionic app. So service worker in mobile Safari, yes. In your web view based app, no. So yeah, I guess Apple's developer page would be a good start, although they don't really like to talk much about PWA. This is not something that they want you doing. They want you going to the App Store, paying money. Yes.
I had another question about service workers. So they are quite powerful because you can, of course, cache everything and you can control the complete networking. But there are also some examples where you can actually shoot yourself in the foot with them. Like you're caching, for example, the service worker yourself. You're caching the index HTML, for example. And some users who have the cached version will never be able to update to a new version of the service worker. Are there any tools, and if so, which, to prevent you from doing that? Which tell you, for example, where your page is broken?
Well, that's why I initially said that it's best to, you're safest when you don't try to write one, when you use a tool like Vue CLI.
Okay, but even if you write one, there could be some, bug in the tools or so.
Yeah, you would debug it using DevTools. For example, in the application tab, you would see all your cached files. Of course, when you're writing your own, you could always shoot yourself in the foot. Like there's a middle ground. You could write your own for the custom stuff that you want to do, but you can use this Workbox plugin to inject the list of assets that have to be cached. So for example, you're extending the server worker by something else. Let's say you're collecting, submissions of your contact form, and once you get online, you want to send them off, something like this. But you're not handling all the caching yourself, so it's like a middle ground.
So no dedicated tool, but just use the existing tools to just generate the service worker for you.
I would say, yeah, that's the best option. And read the recipes. Like Mozilla has a great website. They have for every possible use case. It's a vanilla JavaScript, but it's just common sense what they've done there. So definitely the second link. Right. So then we arrive at the second option to use Vue.js, and my actual favorite. We'll see why. So what's a hybrid Vue.js app? Well, like we said earlier, it's some kind of, first of all, it's mostly tooling. It's tooling that creates an Xcode project and an Android Studio project for you. And it basically usually just copies the bundled JavaScript files in the respective Xcode and Android Studio projects. And when you run it on the device, it instantiates a web view and displays your web app there. Now, usually there's some form or another, there are plugins which are platform dependent, obviously, to interact with the respective device features or stuff that you have only on iOS, only on Android. You have to write platform dependent code. And usually they provide some kind of API via JavaScript so that you can use the camera, the GPS location, stuff like this. So examples would be Cordova, Ionic Capacitor, and so on. Now, there is some confusion regarding Ionic and Cordova with a good reason. Ionic, just until recently, used to actually be a wrapper around Cordova. It was basically Cordova plus some Angular components that more or less try to look native. As of February or January this year, they have completely rewritten Ionic. Now all the components are basically web components using Shadow DOM that you can use via React, Angular, whatever you want. And now there's no hard dependency on Cordova. They have written their own replacement called Capacitor, which we'll see in a minute. Now, Capacitor itself is very similar to Cordova. It includes an actual web server, so it doesn't serve your index.html file directly from the file system. It is also backwards compatible with most Cordova plugins, which is really helpful. And one very important differentiation to Cordova is that it has a completely different approach to managing your projects. Like Cordova itself tries to always recreate the Xcode and the Android Studio project based on your configuration, while on Capacitor you're actually encouraged to submit your created projects in Git and to manage all the local libraries that you use. Like for example, you're actually encouraged to include libraries on iOS via CocoaPods, on Android via Gradle, and to configure them in the actual project. Now, a very nice side effect of this is that there's a lot less area for errors. Like this year I have already done migrated 2 ex-Cordova projects to Capacitor, and the amount of weird little edge cases has gone drastically down from the previous version. Now, regarding Cordova backwards compatibility, of course, not everything works, but many of these Cordova plugins aren't actually needed in the new system because we have APIs included right into the framework. Like, for example, we'll see an example with the camera later. Local notifications, really important one that you usually have to, like push notifications, really important one that you almost in any app that you install on the device you need. So best way to learn about it, let's add it to an existing Vue.js project. We can go to an existing Vue.js app and write in the root, basically install Capacitor core. With the save flag, we actually do want the capacitor dependency in the app. We'll see later that it doesn't really in any way interfere with the PWA version. Now, we also install the CLI, and then we get support for the cap command, which we use to manage all the capacitor stuff. Now, if we actually try these suggestions that Capacitor gives us, where it's gonna error out, because it's gonna try to find a www folder. This is, I guess, something that stayed from Cordova days. And obviously on Vue, the folder that you compile into is usually called dist. So we would go into the Capacitor config file, we can rename the webdir in dist. And if we just build the Vue.js app and then try to add the platform again, this time it'll work. It might take a long time because it's doing a lot of stuff. But once it's done, we can either go via our file manager and open the actual Xcode project and compile it there, or we can even use this little command that opens Xcode for us. The only thing that's left then is to, like on iOS specifically, you have to configure signing. You hit run, and if you're lucky, you can see your default Vue.js app with the default Capacitor splash screen. Now, what about if we want to try to, like, normally you would, every time you edit the app code and recompile, you would have to run npx cap copy, which basically copies the bundled files in the Xcode project, and then you would manually have to click run. It just takes a long time. So with this little trick, we can add hot module replacement. Because our Vue.js app, hopefully created with the Vue CLI, is already using Webpack, we can leverage the HMR capability. Like if we start the dev server of Vue and then add the same URL, this is basically our machine's URL on the local network. If we add it to the Capacitor config and again copy the files and recompile in Xcode, magically we have HMR. So every time we edit the code, the app on the device updates, as long as it's on the same network. Now, what could we do with this capability? Let's try doing some camera action. So we add a new link in the home. We add it to the router, and we add a really simple camera component It's basically just a title and a button. And what the button does is, first of all, we include the camera plugin, which is bundled in Capacitor. As you may notice, we're not asking for permission to use the camera. We're not checking if there's support for the camera. That's because Capacitor degrades gracefully. Like, for example, later when we, first of all, we do the photo. It detects that we haven't asked for permission, so it does this for us. It uses the respective native APIs, like on iOS it does this view. Then we can take a selfie. And if we try this on desktop, the take photo wouldn't do anything. Now we could try for basically for all available plugins. We could check for support and maybe try to hide the link if there's no support. But on a modern browser, actually there is camera support as long as you have a webcam. We just don't have a view to use, like because on native you have this, I don't know, you have the camera view, you have the button to take the photo. You don't have this on web, so you could actually use Ionic PWA elements. So this is a collection of Shadow DOM web components that act as a kind of polyfill for native functions, like for example the camera app. So this is in the root view component. Right after the layout is first rendered, I'm just basically mounting the Shadow DOM components, and then we can take a selfie from Firefox. This is on desktop. This is not even a PWA, and it still works. So what about theming a Capacitor app or a hybrid view app? Obviously, you can use everything that you're used to, like Vuetify, Bootstrap, Element UI, and so on. This is one of the big benefits of going not only the hybrid approach, but also the PWA approach. You could also, if you're doing Capacitor, try using the new Ionic version 4 components, which do look quite nice. They look almost native. But as we can see, the Vue integration for them is still kind of in a beta. All the documentation is empty, all the latest builds are quite old actually, and fading currently. But this is definitely a project I personally am keeping an eye on, because they are quite good, the components that they have. Now, some key takeaways from the hybrid approach would be, obviously everything that applies to PWA applies too. Like, we can leverage all the existing Vue ecosystem and just JS vanilla libraries for anything. Like a recent project I did on Capacitor, I needed encryption for signing and for key generation. This was a voting app, and so I basically just used random crypto.js library off of npm. It works, no problems there. Now, when not used, obviously, if you want to be able to always update the app, then you would need a PWA. Also, compared to the native approach, the performance just isn't there. Like, even if you use something like Vuetify, which is a very high quality library, and package it as a Capacitor app, it still doesn't feel native. Even on, it is material design, but you open it on the Android phone and it looks the part, but it doesn't behave the part. You have the little drawer, and it doesn't move like you're used to. You click it and it closes. It's not as fluid as an actual native app. So if that's important to you, then you might have to look at something else, like the native approach. In quotes, because it's close to native, it's not 100% native. Now, the actual approach that we can take with Vue is NativeScript. It's a little unknown, but is actually older than React Native. It works in a similar way. It tries to render native widgets on the respective platforms. All the business logic is done in JavaScript. One key difference that NativeScript has to React Native, and that's its biggest strength, I think, is that instead of writing all all the functionality that's specific to a platform in the local languages, like in Java, Kotlin, or Objective-C and Swift, and then bridging that to JavaScript. What they do with NativeScript is they actually inject all the APIs. Like you can actually write platform-specific code with your JavaScript. Like for example, that's an example from the official camera app of NativeScript that we're going to use later. And this is actually TypeScript. But if you look close, it's actually Swift, because it is in a way Swift. They are actually implementing a Swift interface, and they have all the constructors like a real Swift class written in TypeScript. And this is not even a community project. This is actual internal code of NativeScript. They actually write their actual core functionalities in JavaScript and TypeScript, which is pretty impressive, I think. What about Vue? Using Vue with NativeScript. This actually started out as a side project by this guy, Igor Randjavovic. He was in his free time trying to, I don't know, messing around, and he managed to get it working 2 years ago. And at VueJS Conf this year, it was announced that it's actually now a supported flavor of NativeScript. So it's still a community project, but you could pay the company behind NativeScript to support you. They have official support. So the best way to try out NativeScript is actually the playground. They have quite amazing playground. I didn't know about it initially, but I talked to some of the guys from NativeScript at VueJS Conf, and they gave me the tip to try it. And it's a real lifesaver. So how does it work? We go to play.nativescript.org. We choose the flavor, because we could actually use NativeScript with plain JavaScript. We don't need an actual framework, a front-end framework for that. But in our case, we choose VueJS. Then we get this QR code. What do we do with this? Well, you actually have to install an app from the App Store. Use that to, this is the app in the middle. You scan the QR code, and then magically everything that you're seeing in the playground gets rendered on your device. And it gets refreshed as you update the code. You can even use this little visual library to like add the basically whole configurations of components with the mouse. You just click it and drag it, and there you have it. So regarding NativeScript, I guess my most important tip would be rely on the playground. Even if you're in the middle of a big project, try out new things in the playground before you break your app. It is quite buggy though. Like you would have to restart the preview app from time to time. Now if you look close, we don't actually have HTML, because those are all custom elements. In some cases they do look similar to their HTML counterparts, but in the end they are quite different, and this is a very, very important thing, because initially, I mean, we are web developers. We go in with our DOM mentality. We're thinking DOM. Everything is this tree of, I don't know, diffs and stuff like that, and we don't have that in this case. Like, they have managed to implement CSS, which is maybe kind of expected for us web developers, but when you come to think about it, it's quite amazing, because we don't have any DOM here. What they're doing is they're parsing the CSS, and they're actually using the local native SDKs. Like, I don't know, even animation works, for God's sake. You can do some animation with a CSS property, and then it actually parses it and uses like on iOS, it uses real, I don't know, iOS animations. However they're done. I'm not an iOS developer. One big omission is that almost no positioning works with CSS. Besides padding and margin, everything else you actually have to do with components, like stack layout, flexbox layout, grid layout. They have quite a few of those, but this was one important gotcha that initially got me when I was filling out NativeScript. Here's a list of other things to be aware of, like, for example, that it really is a separate project. It is a community project. It has its separate documentation. It has its completely separate release cycle, separate versioning, and so on. Not all available components are integrated into Vue, but because the base is vanilla.js and it's not tied to any framework, technically, if you look at the standard documentation of NativeScript, if something is missing from the Vue.js documentation, you could adapt it. You could register it as a component, or let's say as a mixin, or whatever, however you want to use it. You could get creative in this sense. One important difference to the web version is there's no Vue router yet. They're working on it. And one thing that really confused me at one point is that there are two package.json files. One is the actual Node.js package.json. The other is basically their own version of a config file, like we had in Ionic. We had this capacitor.json. It's the same thing. You specify your app's title, your bundle ID, and things like that. I don't know why they've chosen that name. It's really confusing. So let's try it out. There are two ways in which you can use NativeScript with Vue currently. There is a Vue CLI plugin, which allows you to some extent to write web code and native code in the same component. But I find that it is quite unreliable, and at the current state, I would suggest just using the normal NativeScript CLI. We can install it globally, and then it's called TNS. We can just create a fresh project, and with the Vue flag, we can tell it that we want the Vue flavor. Now, it gives us some instructions, and if we follow them, something quite magical happens. Right in the terminal, it generates a QR code, like the one we saw earlier. With the same app that we used with the playground, we can scan the QR code, and then on our device, via the internet, the device is not even connected to the computer, we have the preview that refreshes when we save the code. Now, let's see how a NativeScript Vue app looks. In the beginning, it looks quite similar to Vue. I mean, we have the Vue global, which is actually a wrapper around or re-implementation of the actual Vue instance, because in this case we don't have to bind to any DOM element. That's why we have the instance method start. This is the thing that actually boots the web view. Frame in the template could be thought of as I guess the HTML tag in HTML, or the body tag, one of both, whichever you like. And yeah, here we have the home component. It's again no HTML, but I mean most of these are self-explanatory. The action bar is obviously the little thing on top with the title. Page is, I guess, in HTML terms, it would be the thing that you put the container class or ID on, or the app ID. Then yeah, I mean there are some weird things around strings, but if you're an iOS developer, or if you've done any iOS development in your life, you will know that, for example, strings are quite weird in Objective-C and Swift. So some of that weirdness is, of course, translated into this system. Now, it is an actual Vue component. Like, we have a script section, which pretty much does nothing. We have a SAS section. It can even be scoped. Stuff like this now works. And they're moving at a quite fast pace. Some of these things, like the scope, didn't work when I tested it earlier this year. Now, when I was doing my testing for the talk, many of the things that I was stumbling with were working now. So let's take this default app and make it look more like the default VueJS app that we get from the CLI. We could add the VueJS logo in an image tag. We could add the title. Like in NativeScript, you don't really have a title tag. You have labels, and you can add classes to them. You can add your own classes and style them, and they have some built-in classes. Like H2, for example, comes right out of the box. We also have a link to the about page that we're going to create now. And obviously the navigation is quite manual at the moment. It's like, for example, when using the view router and you just manually push or go on the view router. This is we'll get to that, but this is basically a limitation, a current limitation of NativeScript. Yeah, like we have the home component has a script section which, because of this limitation with the routing, we are actually passing the component as a property, and that's why we can call navigate to about. It's basically a property of the component, and also some styles to make it look more like Vue. The about page, nothing fancy, just a title, and it looks like this. And here's I mean, you can't really see it on the screenshots, but hopefully you'll be able to see it now. But the transitions are actual native transitions. This is really, you can never get this with a web app, no matter how many hours you spend optimizing your CSS transitions and request animation frame and whatever. This is just, can we watch it again just to appreciate the smoothness? This is an actual native app. Not doing much, but yes. So how about we replicate what we already did with the Ionic version? Now, all the plugins aren't included like they were with Capacitor. We have to install them separately. You could, almost everything that you can do with NPM, you can also do with TNS. This has also historic reasons, because at the start where NativeScript was starting, all the Node ecosystem wasn't that stable, so they basically had their own tooling for almost everything. Also, back then there were weird things like Bower and stuff like that. Okay, so how about that camera? It's more or less the same thing that we did with Capacitor. We have a title, a button, and an image that gets conditionally rendered if there is an image. So one key thing to notice maybe is that many things that we expect with our DOM mentality aren't the way here. Like, for example, any kind of component that accepts text, you don't put the text in the XML tag, you put it in a property. Also, all the event handlers are called a bit differently, like you don't have clicks, you have tabs. So what does tab do? In the script section of the component, we import the camera plugin and some utilities to work with images, because when you come to think about it, what's happening here is actually quite complex. Like on iOS and on Android, you have completely different ways to handle images. You can encode them differently. You can save them to the file system or to some temporary location, and this is all handled for you. So in this case, when I tap the button, it attempts to take an image, then attempts to take an actual temporary location from the image asset, and places it in the component properties if one is found. So yeah, works pretty much the same way as the native version. We can also, again, look at my pretty selfie and appreciate the smoothness. This is really a native app for what's worth it. So now we saw that navigation is a bit tricky at the moment. It's quite manual. The guy who did the Vue integration in his free time, he also did like sort of like a Vue router similar library. It doesn't work really the same way, but it does make your life easier. So take a look at that. I actually appreciate the fact that in NativeScript you're not tied to that DOM mentality. You don't have links that you follow. You could go crazy. You could do really weird things. Like, for example, I said, how about I re-implement tab navigation like we get on iOS, and nowadays on Android, some apps. So yeah, just from the documentation, picked the tab component. I extracted all the homepage, all the different pages in separate components, removed the page and the header bar and all this stuff, because now we are getting from each component just the content and putting it in the tab. I basically loop through a list of tabs and through a list of components. You can see that in the script section. And I just have a selected tab index. Like this is the same spontaneous creativity that you have with Vue, because it doesn't restrict you the same way as something like Angular does, combined with real mobile, with native. Then yeah, we remove all the extraneous shit and just leave the content there. And without reading any like tutorial or best practices or anything, you re-implement mobile navigation. Every component is now on the same page, so we have a nice side effect that the photo actually stays when I switch pages, because technically I'm not reloading the component, it's in the same component. Yeah, one more thing. You can actually use the standalone version of the Vue DevTools, the Electron app. And it's quite straightforward. Actually, you just install the dependencies, and then in your main NativeScript Vue JavaScript file, like in the entry, you tell Vue to use the DevTools, and if you're running on a device and not on an emulator, you specify the IP of the local machine. Now, if you try to actually do this right now, it'll fail, because the current version of the standalone Vue DevTools app is broken. There's an issue about that in GitHub from earlier today. But yeah, you have the actual, like when you do this and it works, imagine it working. The standard Vue DevTools that we know from the browser gets opened in a separate Electron app, and then we can actually inspect the app, no matter if it's running on a device or an emulator. Yeah, so some key takeaways from NativeScript. Obviously, it's kind of the opposite of the hybrid approach. You should use it when performance is critical for you, or that native feel, this smoothness. Obviously, it's a lot more cumbersome because not all of your DOM mentality and knowledge translates well. You will have a lot of stumbling blocks, and you can't really leverage anything like Vuetify or Bootstrap, whatever, any kind of existing tool. Yeah, but to me, this is probably the most interesting approach we have. It's not one that I would take with, for example, an important customer project, but it's one that I would definitely keep an eye on and maybe try for a side project. So some important links. Like I said, NativeScript has separate documentation from the NativeScript Vue. And the third one is actually quite fun. It's a tutorial from Jen Looper from Progress, the company behind NativeScript. Yeah, it's quite fun tutorial. Should try it. Now, right at the end, I was thinking a lot about my logic behind my choice, because my obvious choice is capacitor, like I said at the beginning. The thing is that it strikes a middle ground. You can leverage all your existing knowledge and your existing tools, your existing libraries. At the same time, you do have access to the full device features and platform-specific features. You're not limited by, for example, in PWA, you can never really rely on Apple. Sometimes they fix some bug. Many times they actually introduce a bug in the next version. Yes, they really don't like PWAs, which is amazing for considering they're in a way the creator of PWAs. Now, like I said, NativeScript probably the most interesting approach to me personally, because you can really go crazy with it. You can do things not possible with a web app. Yes. that's pretty much my overview. Any questions? Yes? Yes.
At the Vue part, you was showing an example where the app was pointing at the local server.
Mm-hmm.
Is this also an approach that you can use this in a productive App Store app that you're pointing on a web server?
You would not get approved by Apple. You could use it, but your app will not get approved.
Oh, okay.
That's the thing.
From the marketplace.
So that's the.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, I showed earlier that Capacitor can actually load all the JavaScript assets from a remote server. I was using this as a workaround for hot module replacement. The question was if we could do this in an actual production app that we submit to the App Store. And you could, but you would 99, like almost for sure, not get approved. It's back a couple of years ago when the review policies weren't that strict. You could sort of do things like that. I have actually shipped, for example, Cordova-based VueJS apps that would actually self-update every time you start them. And the app is in the App Store. It's still in the App Store. It does self-update. But for any new apps, I think there's almost no chance of it getting in. They don't want you to circumvent the App Store. The other question was, yes?
One slide back, you showed these performance issues, limited performance and high performance.
Yes. Well, this is all relative.
Say again?
This is all relative, of course.
Right.
I mean, sorry, I interrupted you. What's the question?
I was just wondering, like, how do you?
Yeah, well.
How they will reflect in your app? I mean, what kind of performance issues?
Yeah, depends. First of all, depends a lot on the app. Of course, you wouldn't be doing. I mean, it is relative. There are actually, for example, Electron apps that do the same thing like Sketch or Photoshop. You could do this as a web app, but I think it's never gonna be close to the actual native counterpart, and you would have to do crazy optimizations to get it that fast. Like for something like Twitter, obviously there's no difference in performance. Also, the native version doesn't use any fancy transitions. It's every time you switch a tab, it just switches the tab. So in cases like this is not really. Then you can forget about this limitation.
You always have an interpreter between.
Yeah, for sure.
In native, you don't have this.
Well, I mean, with NativeScript, you do have a runtime, so there is some kind of delay. On iOS bigger than on Android because you still don't have the V8 JavaScript virtual machine on iOS. But as far as I know, they are working on implementing it. But even with V8, even when it's jitted, it's still JavaScript. One important aspect that actually helps with the performance on NativeScript is you have actual threads. You could write multi-threaded code using JavaScript. Not saying that you should, but you could.
You always use Ionic Capacitor?
Maybe I think I wasn't very clear in that section, but my preferred approach is to actually just use Capacitor, not Ionic.
Okay.
So
only Capacitor and Vue.
yes. That way, first of all, you're free to choose your front-end framework. You could use Vuetify if you prefer material design. You could use, I don't know, maybe Quasar, but I think Quasar is, they have the standalone components, but they're also somehow tied to Cordova. But you could use any normal front-end framework.
Only Vue and Capacitor.
Yes. Yes, and like we saw, there's almost no penalty for the PWA version because Capacitor is smart enough to check for the device features. Even if you don't explicitly check, it won't break your website if you try to, let's say, receive a push notification or something. Or, I don't know, take a photo of a QR code.
If I'm building with Capacitor and Vue.js and Webpack, do I hand over my bundle to Capacitor or what does it use?
That is completely handled by the Vue CLI. So maybe it wasn't very clear, but in the terminal I run npm run serve, for example, which is just a built-in script that Vue CLI creates for you. So I mean, technically you have all the, like for example, when you import your modules, you also get all the tree shaking and the separate JavaScript files, and Capacitor doesn't care. It's a web server like any other.
Okay.
So technically it could even improve performance even on the installed version. If let's say some section of your app requires, I don't know, 1 megabyte of JavaScript, you're doing something crazy, calculating the movements of the planets or whatever, then it would save you time with the tree shaking and the separate bundles from Webpack.
Also regarding the statement of Apple to, not bundle PWAs or any HTML5 apps into the App Store, isn't kind of a deal breaker for all solutions that bundle web apps into hybrid applications? Because if they back down, like in March 2020, and they don't allow any new apps with web applications inside of them?
No. So I wasn't clear enough. The distinction is they don't want all the JavaScript files to come from the internet. If they're actually bundled in the IPA or APK in the sense of Android, then it's okay. I mean, of course, that's if they forbid this, then 40% of the apps would go away.
Yeah, but it was interesting because I thought, and Apple is itself like always interprets these guidelines in the way they want.
Yes, of course.
So that could actually happen. Yeah, that's what could happen.
I think it's unlikely because as much as they've both Google with, for example, Kotlin and Flutter and Apple with Swift have improved the native mobile experience, for example, for us web developers, it's still not the same as web development, and they don't want to lose like 30% of their developers for their platform. So I don't think that's... What they care about is that you don't update your app without them knowing. They want to approve each version of your app. Because, and it's understandable, imagine you downloaded something off of the App Store, it works fine, then the next day it's silently self-updates and now it's mining Bitcoin on your device. So things like that.
As you just mentioned, multi-threading, isn't there a feature that was introduced in HTML5, the web workers, that is also a kind of multi-threading?
Yes, of course.
And is this something we can use in a hybrid app or in a PWA app? Or is this just the native? You
could use it in a hybrid app with the respective limitations of the platform. Like we saw on iOS, for example, mobile Safari has a service worker, but the web view that they allow you to embed doesn't.
Okay.
But as long as the actual web view supports it, you can use it in the hybrid approach, of course.
Okay.
You can offload as much as you want. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
No more questions?
Yeah, I have one question related to augmented reality, AR kit. Does any of this supports AR kits? Like, is there any
question.
roadmap for support?
So I haven't read anything about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if the NativeScript guys are working on it, because like I said earlier, they're moving really quick. They're like the iPhone version wasn't working earlier this year. Now in the blog I'm reading they're working on Apple Watch support. So yeah, that's another thing. Next year, maybe one of these meetups, we're talking about Vue on the Apple Watch. So I don't know. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're working on ARKit support. Yes. Thanks a lot.